There is a book you have been reading your whole life. You have heard it preached on Sunday mornings. You have heard it quoted at funerals and whispered over hospital beds. You have seen it printed on church fans, embroidered on throw pillows, framed on the walls of grandmothers who never missed a service. You think you know this book, but what if the version of this book you were handed, the version that was preached over you, taught to you, pressed into your hands, was never the whole story? What if the most important thing hidden inside it was the one thing that was never supposed to reach you? We are talking about Genesis, not Revelation, not Daniel, not the end times prophecy content that floods your feed. Genesis, the beginning, the first book, the one that opens with light-splitting darkness and ends with a man who was sold by his own brothers lying in a coffin in Egypt, full of hope for a people who hadn't been born yet. Genesis is not a simple book. It never was. But for Black Americans, now for Black Christians who grew up in the church, who were raised on Scripture, who have heard the Bible preached in every key and every register, Genesis carries a wound that most people never talk about out loud. Because here is what actually happened to this book. When enslaved Africans were first forced onto American soil, the slaveholders who claimed to be Christians did not hide the Bible. They used it. They weaponized it. And the book they reached for first, the one they stood up in pulpits and read aloud to people in chains, was Genesis. Specifically, Genesis chapter 9, the so-called curse of Ham. Noah curses his son Canaan after Ham sees his father's nakedness. That passage, that moment, that is what they preached. That is what they built a theology of racial hierarchy on. That is what they used to tell an entire people, that their suffering was ordained, that their bondage was biblical, that the God of all creation had placed them beneath others by design. It was a lie. Biblical scholars have documented it thoroughly. The curse in Genesis 9 was never a racial curse. It was never applied to African peoples in the original text. And the interpretation used to justify slavery was manufactured, distorted, and deliberately weaponized. The historians confirm it. The theologians confirm it. The text itself does not support what they preached, but the damage was done. And the consequence that nobody talks about enough, is that it did not just give slaveholders a false justification. It made Black Americans suspicious of Genesis, rightfully suspicious, cautiously suspicious. Because the first time they heard it preached with any power, it was being used against them. So what did the Black church do? What the Black church has always done, it survived, it adapted, it found the Psalms, found the Gospels, found Exodus and Moses, and the God who heard the cry of the oppressed. The Black church built a magnificent spiritual house on the books it could trust, the passages it could breathe in, but Genesis stayed complicated. Genesis stayed wounded, and that wound and that hesitation, that spiritual distance from the first book may have cost us something. Because while the plantation pulpit was preaching one verse from Genesis to keep people in chains, there were other verses sitting in the same book. Older verses, deeper verses, verses that were never read aloud to the people in the fields, verses that carried not a curse, but a covenant, not a justification for suffering, but an acknowledgement of it, and a promise about what comes after. There is a warning hidden in Genesis, not the warning they preached at you, not the false theology designed to make you accept a position at the bottom of someone else's order, a different warning. A warning written thousands of years before the first slave ship left the coast of West Africa. Of a warning tucked inside a promise God made to one man on one night, under a sky so full of stars the man stopped counting. A warning that when you hear it clearly, when you read it without the distortion, without the centuries of manipulation layered on top of it, sounds less like ancient history and more like a dispatch from the present moment. Black America cannot afford to miss this right now, not because the sky is falling, not because some new prophecy has been unlocked, But because the moment we are living in, the economic pressure, the political turbulence, the cultural erosion, the quiet dismantling of systems Black people spent generations fighting to build, this moment has a shape, and that shape has appeared before. Genesis knows this shape, and if we are willing to go back to that book, not the version that was handed to us by people who needed us broken, but the actual text, the full text, the text that has always been waiting, well, we might find something we desperately need right now. Not just comfort, not just inspiration, a warning, and embedded inside the warning, a promise, but there is something else in that book, something that was never preached from those plantation pulpits, something they left out. Open your Bible to Genesis chapter 15. Not chapter 9, not the verse they handed you. Chapter 15, find verse 13. Read it slowly. Read it the way you would read a letter that had been addressed to you for centuries but somehow never delivered. Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. That is not from a commentary. That is not from a theologian with an agenda or a social media account trying to build a following. That is Genesis 15 verses 13 and 14. The words God spoke directly to Abraham on the night he made a covenant with him. The night the scripture says Abraham looked up at a sky full of stars and God told him his descendants would be as numerous as what he saw above him. On that same night, in that same conversation, in the middle of a promise about multiplication and legacy and land and future, God said this: strangers, enslaved, mistreated 400 years, and then judgment on the nation that held them, and then emergence with great possessions. That is the covenant that was never preached from the plantation pulpit, and I want you to sit with why. Think about what it would have meant, what it would have cost for an enslaved person to hear those verses read aloud in full. Think about what it would have done to the theology of the slaveholder if the people sitting in those pews, the people in those fields, the people being held in bondage had known that the God of the Bible had not only seen their suffering, but had named it, had numbered it, and had already declared what he intended to do to the nation that perpetrated it. That changes everything about the power dynamic. That is not a story of a cursed people resigned to the bottom. That is a story of a covenanted people in the middle of a promised ark. There is a difference. There is an enormous, life-altering, generation-shaping difference between those two stories, and somebody knew that, and somebody made a choice about which one to preach and which one to leave out. This is not conspiracy thinking. This is documented history. The scholar Howard Thurman, one of the most important religious thinkers the Black church has ever produced, the man who mentored Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the man whose book Jesus and the Disinherited shaped the entire intellectual foundation of the civil rights movement. Thurman wrote openly about the way scripture was selectively presented to enslaved people. He described how his grandmother, who had been enslaved, told him that the white minister who occasionally preached to the enslaved community almost always preached from Paul's letters about servants obeying masters. She told him that he almost never preached Jesus. And when Thurman grew up and read the full Bible for himself, unfiltered, unedited, without the selective lens, he found something entirely different. He found a Jesus who stood with the disinherited. He found a God who remembered the oppressed. He found Genesis 15. This is what selective biblical presentation does. It does not just withhold information, it reshapes identity. It trains a people to see themselves in the text as the ones being warned, the ones being cursed, the ones at the bottom of a divine hierarchy. When the full text, read honestly, tells a completely different story. And here is the thing about Genesis 15 that does not get preached even now. Even in the Black church that reclaimed its dignity and built its own theology. The covenant God made with Abraham is not just a promise of land and descendants. It is a promise that includes suffering as part of the story. God does not pretend the suffering will not happen. He does not spiritually bypass the 400 years. He names it. He acknowledges it. He tells Abraham to his face, your people are going to go through something that will seem unsurvivable. And then he says, I have already accounted for it. I have already prepared the response. The nation that does this to them will not go unpunished, and your people will come out. That is not the theology of a people who are cursed. That is the theology of a people who are covenanted, and there is a pastoral weight to that distinction that the Black church needs to feel again right now, because here is what covenantal suffering means and why it matters in this specific moment in American history. When suffering is random, when there is no framework, no context, no larger story holding it, it crushes people. It produces despair. It produces the kind of generational trauma that has no anchor and no horizon. When you do not know why you are suffering, when you do not know how long it will last, when you do not know whether anyone sees it or cares, that suffering has a particular kind of brutality to it. It does not just hurt the body, it dismantles the self. But when suffering is covenantal, when it exists inside a story that God himself narrated in advance, when it is not a sign of abandonment but a sign of being known, it does not stop hurting. Let me be honest about that. The 400 years were still 400 years. The enslaved still suffered. The mistreatment was still real and brutal and generational. The covenant did not make the pain disappear, but it changes what the pain means. It means God was not surprised. It means the suffering was not proof of divine indifference. It means there was always more to the story than the chapter the world was watching. And it means the end of the chapter was already written before the middle even began. Now listen, I am not standing here telling you that Genesis 15 is a direct one-to-one prophecy mapping onto the transatlantic slave trade with mathematical precision. That is an interpretive tradition. Serious scholars have engaged it. Theologians within the Black church have wrestled with it for generations, and it is a tradition that deserves to be taken seriously, not as a proven historical equation, but as a covenantal lens, a way of reading the Black experience in America through the only framework that has ever given it meaning without cheapening it. What I am saying is this: long before the first ship, long before the first auction block, long before the first generation born into bondage on American soil, there was a God who spoke to a man under a night sky and told him that his descendants were going to be strangers in a land that was not their own, that they were going to be enslaved and mistreated, and that he, the God making the covenant, was not going to abandon them inside that. That covenant was still in effect when the ships left the coast of West Africa. It was still in effect during the Middle Passage. It was still in effect during Reconstruction and its violent collapse. It was still in effect during the Great Migration. It was still in effect through Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement and every subsequent generation that woke up in America, still carrying the weight of everything that came before. The covenant does not expire. And if the covenant does not expire, if the pattern Genesis 15 describes is still the operating framework for how God moves on behalf of a suffering people, then the second half of that verse is not just history. It is the part we are still waiting to fully see. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. Afterward. That word should not be rushed past. That word is doing an enormous amount of theological work. Afterward does not mean immediately. Afterward does not mean easily. Afterward does not mean without cost or grief or the kind of exhaustion that runs so deep it gets passed down in the blood. Afterward means on the other side of this, there is something. There is an emergence. There is a coming out. There is a moment when the covenant moves from the patient endurance of the middle to the declared fulfillment of the end. The Black church has always known this. The spirituals encoded it. The prayers carried it. Every grandmother who told her grandchildren to keep going, every pastor who stood in a storefront church and preached hope to people who had no material reason for hope, they were testifying to Genesis 15, whether they cited the chapter and verse or not. They were reaching back to the covenant. They were preaching the afterword. But here is what makes this urgent right now. Right now, in the specific American moment we are living in. The pattern that Genesis 15 describes is not just a comfort for a suffering people. It is also a warning. And that warning is embedded right there in the same verse, right before the promise of emergence. God tells Abraham, "The nation that holds your descendants in bondage will be punished." That is not just a promise to the suffering people. That is a warning to the empire. That is a word to Pharaoh. That is a declaration that the arrangement, the hierarchy, the extraction, the system built on the suffering of the covenanted people has a shelf life. And when that shelf life expires, the consequences are not going to be quiet or polite or easily absorbed. Genesis has always known this. Egypt found out. And every empire that has built its prosperity on the suffering of a covenanted people has eventually had a reckoning with that verse. The question is not whether the pattern holds. History has answered that question. The question is whether we are wise enough, spiritually discerning enough, awake enough to recognize what moment we are actually standing in. Because if the pattern in Genesis 15 is the operating framework and the evidence that it is carries enormous weight, then Black America right now is not standing at the beginning of the suffering. It is standing somewhere inside the afterward. And that changes how you read the headlines. It changes how you pray. It changes how you lead your family, how you build your community, how you respond to the pressure that is being applied right now from every direction. The covenant was never meant to produce fear. It was meant to produce discernment. And if that passage sounds familiar, it should. Because the pattern it describes did not end with Egypt. Before we talk about the promise, we have to talk about the pit, because the Black church has always loved the Joseph story, and rightfully so. Joseph is one of the most preached narratives in the entire Bible. Walk into almost any Black congregation in America on any given Sunday, and somewhere, somehow, the Joseph story is either being preached directly or it is living underneath whatever text the pastor chose. It is embedded in the DNA of Black preaching. The dreamer who was brought low and raised up, the man who went from the pit to the palace, the one who suffered and then saw God turn it around. We have preached the ending of that story with tremendous power. But I want to go back to the beginning, because the beginning of the Joseph story contains something that the triumph at the end can sometimes cause us to rush past. And what is sitting in that beginning and what is waiting there in the uncomfortable early chapters that we tend to sprint through to get to the good part has something urgent to say to Black America in this moment. So let us go back to Genesis 37. Joseph is 17 years old. He is the son of Jacob, grandson of Isaac, great-grandson of Abraham, the covenant line running directly through him. He has been given a coat. You know the coat of many colors, the ornamented robe, the visible sign of his father's particular love for him. He has also been given dreams, 2 of them. Dreams so vivid, so directional, so clearly supernatural that when he describes them, even his father pauses. In the first dream, his brother's sheaves of grain bow down to his. In the second, the sun and moon and 11 stars bow down to him. Joseph tells his brothers both dreams, and the text says, and do not rush past this, the text says his brothers hated him even more. The dreams did not create the hatred. The hatred was already there, but the dreams gave it a sharper edge. Because the brothers could see something in Joseph that they could not tolerate. Not just their father's favoritism, something else, something they recognized as real and could not bring themselves to honor. They hated him for what God had placed on him. And one day, when they are out in the fields, away from their father, away from anyone who would intervene, they see him coming from a distance, and they make a decision. They take the dreamer, they strip him of his coat, and they throw him into a pit. Genesis 37:24 says the pit was empty, no water in it, just Joseph at the bottom with the sound of his brothers sitting down to eat a meal directly above him while he cried out to them. The text in Genesis 42 tells us later in Joseph's brothers' own words that they heard his distress. They heard him. They sat down and ate anyway. Then a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passes by on their way to Egypt. And Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, one of the men who will later become a patriarch of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, Judah looks at that caravan and says, "What do we gain if we kill him? Let us sell him instead." And they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. The dreamer was sold by his own family. I need you to feel the full weight of that before we move forward. Because this is not just a biographical detail in an ancient story. This is the part of the Joseph narrative that Black Americans carry in their bones without always knowing where the ache comes from. The pit is not an abstraction. The selling is not a metaphor. The brothers sitting above him eating while he called out from below is not just a dramatic scene in a sacred text. It is a pattern. It is a wound. It is a memory that runs deeper than any single generation. The dreamer sold by people who should have protected him, stripped of what distinguished him, thrown into darkness, traded for silver and sent away to a land that was not his own. If that pattern sounds familiar, it is because you have been living inside an echo of it. But here is what I want to focus on. Here is where the warning lives that the triumph at the end can cause us to overlook. Joseph arrives in Egypt. He does not arrive as a conqueror. He does not arrive with negotiating power or legal recourse or a support system waiting to receive him. He arrives as property. He is purchased by a man named Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And the text says something remarkable. It says that God was with Joseph and that he prospered in the house of his Egyptian master. Potiphar sees it, recognizes it, and gives Joseph increasing responsibility until Joseph is running the entire household. This is the part the triumph sermons love to land on. And it is real. It is genuinely significant. The presence of God does not abandon Joseph in Egypt. The gifts that made his brothers hate him in Canaan make him exceptional in Potiphar's house. This is true. But then Potiphar's wife sees Joseph, and she wants him. And when he refuses her, repeatedly, clearly, with integrity, and with explicit reference to his loyalty to God, she does what people who have power and have been denied what they want have always done. She lies. She tells her husband that Joseph tried to assault her. She has his garment as evidence, the garment he left behind when he ran from her. And Potiphar, hearing his wife's accusation, has Joseph thrown into prison. Think about what just happened. Joseph did the right thing. Joseph refused to compromise his integrity. Joseph was faithful to his master and faithful to God. And the consequence, the immediate direct consequence of doing the right thing was imprisonment on a false charge. This is not a small detail. This is the warning, because this is the part of the Joseph story that Black Americans recognize with a specific and terrible familiarity. The false accusation, the system that believes the word of the one with power over the one without it. The prison that receives a man who did nothing wrong. The consequences that fall on the innocent because the powerful needed a story that protected them. The Sentencing Project has documented for years what the criminal justice data shows clearly. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans. Black men specifically face documented disparities at every stage of the criminal justice process, from arrest to charging to sentencing. The false accusation is not ancient history. The prison that receives the innocent is not a Genesis-only phenomenon. Joseph's story and the story of Black men in America rhyme with a precision that should stop us cold. But we are not done yet. Because after the prison, there is a moment in the Joseph narrative that I think is the most underpreached, most overlooked, most quietly devastating passage in the entire story. And it is found in Genesis 40. Joseph is in prison. He has been faithful there too. The text says again that God was with him, and the prison warden puts Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. Two of Pharaoh's officials end up in the same prison, his cupbearer and his baker. They each have dreams that trouble them, and Joseph, the dreamer, interprets both dreams correctly. He tells the cupbearer, "In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position." And then Joseph says something that is almost unbearable to read when you know what comes next. He says, "When it goes well with you, remember me. Mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this place, because I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and I have done nothing here to deserve this prison. Remember me." That is the request. That is all Joseph asks. Remember me. And the cupbearer is restored exactly as Joseph said. He walks out of that prison. He stands before Pharaoh. He resumes his position. He has everything he needs. And Genesis 40:23 says, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." 2 more years pass, 2 years of the pit, 2 years of the prison, 2 years of God being present, but silent in the way that feels the most unbearable. Not absent, not gone, but not yet moving in a way that produces the change Joseph needed. 2 more years of being forgotten by someone who had every reason and every opportunity to remember. I want you to stay in those 2 years for a moment, because the Black church has a tradition of preaching Joseph's triumph with such power and such beauty that we sometimes do not spend enough time in the years that the triumph was preceded by. We do not sit long enough in the silence. We do not honor the weight of what it costs to carry a dream in a world that has thrown you in a pit, sold you to strangers, imprisoned you on a lie, and then forgotten you when someone finally had the chance to help. That silence is not the absence of God. Scripture is clear about that. God was with Joseph the entire time, in the pit, in Potiphar's house, in the prison, in the 2 years after the cupbearer forgot him. God was present in every chapter of Joseph's suffering, but God's presence does not always mean immediate deliverance. And that is a theology the Black church has to be willing to hold with honesty, especially right now, especially in a moment when the pressure on Black communities is intensifying from multiple directions at once, and the deliverance that was promised still feels like it is taking longer than anyone can endure. The warning in the Joseph narrative is not that suffering will come. The people of God already know that. The warning is more subtle and more demanding than that. The warning is about what you do in the years the cupbearer forgets you. The warning is about whether you hold on to the dream when the dream has cost you everything and produced nothing visible yet. The warning is about whether the pit and the prison and the silence and the forgetting will convince you that the coat was never real, that the dreams were never true, that the God who was with you in the beginning has quietly changed his position. Joseph did not curse his brothers from the bottom of the pit. He did not abandon his integrity in Potiphar's house. He did not stop functioning when the prison became his address. And he did not become someone else in the 2 years that the cupbearer forgot him. He remained Joseph. He remained the dreamer. He remained the man God had made him to be, even when every external circumstance was arguing against that identity with tremendous force. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary thing. And it is the thing the Genesis narrative is trying to give Black America right now. Not just the ending, the endurance, not just the palace, the practice of remaining who you are when everything around you is insisting that you are something less. The warning in Genesis is not just about where Joseph ended up. It is about what happened in the years nobody talks about. And those years have something urgent to say to Black America right now. Because the pressure being applied in this current moment, the rolling back of protections that took generations to build, the economic uncertainty, the cultural assault on Black institutions, the the particular kind of weariness that comes from fighting the same battles your grandparents fought and your great-grandparents fought. This pressure is designed to do exactly what the pit and the prison were designed to do. It is designed to make you forget what was placed on you. It is designed to convince you that the coat was never real. It is designed to make the dream seem foolish in light of the present circumstances. And Genesis 37 through 40 is sitting in your Bible right now, looking at this moment, saying, I have seen this before. I know this shape, and I know what it is trying to accomplish, and I know what happens to the people who do not let it take their dream. The uncomfortable middle is not the end of the story, but you have to survive the middle for the end to find you. And that survival requires something specific. Something Genesis is going to name for us in a way we cannot afford to miss, because the warning in this story is not just about endurance, it is about identity, and it is about what Black America needs to understand about where it stands in the larger story God has been telling from the very beginning of this book. Let us talk about right now. Not in the abstract, not in the comfortable distance of theological reflection where we can admire the pattern from far enough away that it does not require anything of us personally. Right now, this moment, the specific American moment that Black Americans are navigating in 2025, with all of its weight and all of its complexity and all of the particular exhaustion that comes from living inside a story that keeps refusing to resolve the way it should. Because the Genesis warning was never meant to be left in the ancient world. The whole point of a covenantal text, the whole point of a narrative that God inscribed into Scripture, rather than letting it remain private between himself and Abraham, is that it is meant to be read. It is meant to be applied. It is meant to be carried into whatever present moment the people of the covenant find themselves standing in and asked, what does this say about where we are right now? So let us ask that question honestly. In June of 2023, the United States Supreme Court issued its ruling in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the case that effectively ended race-conscious admissions at colleges and universities across the country. The majority opinion held that admissions programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Affirmative action, as it had been practiced in higher education for decades, was struck down. For Black Americans, this was not an abstract legal development. This was the dismantling of a tool, an imperfect tool, a contested tool, but a real tool that had helped open doors to institutions that had been legally closed to Black people within living memory. The ruling did not arrive in isolation. It arrived as part of a broader momentum, a documented national rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks across corporations, government agencies, and educational institutions. By early 2025, that rollback had accelerated into executive orders, legislative pressure, and public campaigns designed to characterize DEI itself as discriminatory, to reframe the effort to repair historic exclusion as the new form of injustice. Read that again slowly and let it register. The framework built to address centuries of documented, legally enforced exclusion was being dismantled, and the argument used to dismantle it was that addressing the exclusion was itself a form of discrimination. This is Pharaoh's logic, not metaphorically, structurally. Because Pharaoh's strategy in Exodus, the strategy that Genesis sets the stage for, was never simply brutal force. It was the reframing of the covenanted people's very existence as a threat to the empire. In Exodus 1, Pharaoh looks at a growing Hebrew population and says, "They are too many and too mighty. If war comes, they might join our enemies and fight against us." The threat was constructed, the framing was deliberate, and the policy that followed, the labor intensification, the systemic suppression, the attempt to reduce a covenanted people to a manageable, controllable presence, flowed directly from that constructed framing. You do not have to stretch the parallel very far to feel where it lands. But let us stay with the evidence, because the Genesis warning is not just about political and legal frameworks. It is about the full architecture of pressure. And the architecture being constructed right now is built on multiple levels, simultaneously. The Federal Reserve's data on racial wealth disparity tells a story that has not meaningfully changed in generations. As of the most recent data available, the typical white family holds approximately 7 to 8 times the wealth of the typical black family. That gap did not emerge from different levels of effort or different choices or different values. It emerged from documented systematic policy, redlining that prevented black families from building equity in homes that white families were subsidized to purchase, GI Bill benefits that were administered in ways that largely excluded black veterans, wealth-stripping violence like the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa in 1921, and the ongoing compounding of those original exclusions across every subsequent generation. The wealth gap is not an accident, it is an inheritance of extraction. And now the tools designed to begin addressing that inheritance are being taken apart, piece by piece, reframed as unfair, dismantled with legal and rhetorical precision, while the underlying gap that produced the need for those tools remains intact and continues to compound. Meanwhile, historically black colleges and universities, institutions that were built specifically because black Americans were legally excluded from white institutions, institutions that have produced a disproportionate share of black doctors, lawyers, engineers, educators, and leaders, face ongoing funding pressures that have never been fully resolved. The endowment gap between HBCUs and predominantly white institutions is not a gap, it is a chasm. And in the current political environment, even the modest federal investments directed toward HBCUs are subject to scrutiny, delay, and the kind of bureaucratic friction that institutions with smaller margins cannot absorb as easily as institutions sitting on multi-billion-dollar endowments. This is the pit operating at institutional scale. And then there is the matter of health. The COVID-19 pandemic did not create the black health disparity crisis, it revealed it. Black Americans died at significantly higher rates than white Americans during the pandemic, a pattern documented by the Centers for Disease Control and confirmed by health researchers across the country. And that disparity did not emerge from biology. It emerged from the accumulated weight of inadequate access to healthcare, higher rates of the underlying conditions that are themselves products of chronic stress and environmental exposure, and a medical system with its own documented history of racial bias in treatment and diagnosis. The body carries the covenant suffering too. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where the Genesis warning requires the most precision. It is easy and it is tempting to look at this accumulation of pressure and read it as evidence of abandonment, to look at the rollback of affirmative action, the wealth gap, the HBCU funding crisis, the health disparities, the mass incarceration statistics, and conclude that the covenant has failed. That the afterward is a fiction. That Genesis 15 was a beautiful promise that history has quietly disproven. But that is not what Genesis teaches, and it is not what the Joseph narrative teaches. And if we are going to take the covenant seriously, if we are going to allow the Bible to be the interpretive framework it claims to be, then we have to be willing to read the present moment the way the covenant asks us to read it, which means recognizing that pressure is not proof of abandonment. Joseph was in the pit. God was with him. Joseph was in Potiphar's house. God was with him. Joseph was in the prison. God was with him. Joseph was in the 2 years of being forgotten. God was with him. The presence of pressure, the intensification of difficulty, the experience of being Systematically stripped of tools and protections and the dignity of a fair playing field, none of that is evidence that the covenant has expired. In the Genesis framework, it is actually more consistent with the middle of the covenant arc than with its conclusion. But, and this is where the warning sharpens into something with edges, the Genesis narrative also makes clear that the covenant does not operate apart from the discernment and the choices of the people inside it. Joseph was with God in the pit. But Joseph also made choices in the pit that mattered. He did not curse his brothers. He did not let bitterness consume his identity. He did not allow the stripping of his coat to convince him that what God had placed on him was gone. And in Egypt, Joseph made choices that mattered. He refused Potiphar's wife not once, but repeatedly. He maintained his integrity at the direct cost of his immediate freedom. He kept functioning in the prison. He kept using his gifts. He kept being who God made him, even when the environment was arguing loudly against it. And then, this is the part of the Joseph story that the triumph sermons often skip straight to without adequately preparing the congregation for what it actually cost. When Pharaoh finally summons Joseph from the prison, when the moment of elevation finally arrives, Joseph is ready. He is ready because he never stopped being Joseph, because the years in the pit and the prison and the silence were years in which, despite everything, he kept the dream alive and kept his character intact. Genesis 41 tells us that when Pharaoh presents his dreams and all his magicians and wise men cannot interpret them, the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. Finally, after 2 years, and Joseph is brought from the prison and he stands before the most powerful man in the known world. And Pharaoh says, "I have heard that you can interpret dreams." And Joseph says, "I cannot do it." But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. That is the character that was built in the pit. That is the integrity that survived the prison. That is the identity that 2 years of being forgotten could not erase. Joseph stands before the empire, and his first sentence is a displacement of his own credit in favor of the God who was with him through all of it. That is not a small thing. That is the whole architecture of the covenant in one sentence. So, what does the Genesis warning actually say to Black America right now? It says, the pressure you are under is real. Do not minimize it. Do not spiritually bypass it. The rollback is real. The wealth gap is real. The institutional fragility is real. The weariness is real. The grief of watching protections dismantled that cost generations to build is real. Genesis does not ask you to pretend otherwise, but the warning also says this pressure has a design, and the design is not just to harm you materially. The design is to separate you from your dream. The design is to convince you that what God placed on you was never real. The design is to get you to throw the coat away yourself before anyone else has to take it from you. The design is to make the pit feel permanent when it is not the final destination. The Joseph principle, the one Genesis is trying to hand Black America with both hands right now, is preparation. Strategic, covenant-grounded preparation during the years of pressure for the moment of emergence that the covenant has already declared. In Genesis 41, after Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, he does not stop at the interpretation. He immediately offers a strategy: store a fifth of the harvest during the years of plenty, build reserves, create infrastructure, prepare during the abundance for the scarcity that is coming, so that when the famine arrives, there is something to draw from. Pharaoh's own officials recognize the wisdom in it, and Pharaoh looks at Joseph and says, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." The dreamer who survived the pit becomes the strategist who saves the empire. That is the arc. That is the covenant's shape. But the arc only reaches its full length because Joseph did not let the pit convince him that preparation was pointless. He did not let the prison convince him that wisdom was wasted on someone in his position. Black America has always been a people of preparation. The HBCUs were preparation. The Black Church was preparation. The mutual aid societies, the fraternal organizations, the underground networks of support and survival, all of it was preparation. The genius of the Black community historically is the genius of Joseph. The ability to build something real out of almost nothing, to create institutions that outlast the pressure applied against them, to store up wisdom and community and spiritual resilience during years when the world was not offering much to work with. That genius is being called forward right now, not because the famine is coming, because by most measures, Black America is already inside it. The famine of political protection, of institutional support, of the symbolic and material acknowledgement that the covenant of citizenship actually applies equally. The famine is already here. And the question Genesis 41 is asking, the question Joseph's life is asking, is whether the preparation happened, whether the years before this moment were used to build something that can sustain the community through what is being applied now, and whether in this moment the people of the covenant still have the discernment to function the way Joseph functioned before Pharaoh, not in panic, not in despair, not in the posture of people who have been convinced that the dream was never real, but in the posture of people who know exactly what God placed on them, who survived the pit and the prison and the forgetting, and who are now standing before the moment with something to offer. This is not about fear. The warning in Genesis was never meant to produce fear. It was meant to produce discernment. And discernment begins with knowing who you actually are in the story, which is exactly what Genesis has been trying to tell Black America from the very beginning. And that part of the story, the part about identity, the part about lineage, the part about the African thread that runs through Scripture from Genesis to the last pages of the prophets, that is the part that changes everything about how you read the warning. Because when you know where you are in the story, the warning starts to sound different. It stops sounding like a curse, and it starts sounding like a call. There is a chapter in Genesis that most people read past without stopping, Genesis chapter 10. The Table of Nations. It reads like a genealogy, a long list of names, descendants branching out from Noah's 3 sons after the flood, spreading across the earth and becoming the peoples and nations and languages of the ancient world. Most readers skim it. Most preachers skip it. It does not have the dramatic tension of the Joseph narrative or the covenantal weight of Genesis 15. It is, on the surface, a list of names, but inside that list is something that the American church, specifically the white evangelical tradition that shaped how most people in this country were taught to read the Bible, spent a very long time either ignoring or actively suppressing. Inside Genesis 10 is Africa, not as a footnote, not as a peripheral detail at the edge of the biblical story. Africa and African peoples are present in the Genesis genealogy as central, foundational, named members of the family of nations that God placed on the earth after the flood. They are there from the beginning. They have always been there, and the tradition that read Genesis to Black Americans in chains somehow neglected to mention it. The Bible was never a book that excluded African peoples from the story of God. That exclusion was manufactured. It was imposed. It was a lie so thoroughly embedded in the way the Bible was presented to Black Americans that it became almost impossible to see around it without a sustained, deliberate act of reclamation. That reclamation is what scholars like Felder and Kofer were doing in the academy. It is what Howard Thurman was doing in theology. It is what the Black church has been doing in its spirituals and its prayers and its particular way of reading scripture that has always seen the oppressed as the primary lens through which God's word becomes most clear. And it is what this moment demands, because here is the spiritual weight of knowing that your lineage is in Genesis 10. Here is what changes when you read the Table of Nations and see Cush and Mizraim and understand that the Africa those names represent is not tangential to the biblical story, but foundational to it. It means that when you open Genesis, you are not reading someone else's family history, you are reading yours. It means that the covenant God made with Abraham in Genesis 15, the covenant of suffering and deliverance, the promise of the afterward, was made to a man who lived in a world that included your ancestors, a world in which Cush was a great nation, a world in which Mizraim was the most powerful empire on earth, a world in which African peoples were not an afterthought but a central presence in the geography and the history and the spiritual landscape that the Bible is describing. It means that the warning hidden in Genesis is not a warning addressed to someone else that you are allowed to observe from a distance. It is a warning addressed to you, to your lineage, to the people whose story runs through this book from the Table of Nations, in Genesis 10 to Psalm 68:31, to the Ethiopian eunuch on the road to Gaza, reading the scroll of Isaiah and asking Philip, of whom does the prophet speak? Of whom does the prophet speak? That question has been hanging in the air over the Black church in America for 400 years. And the answer, the full answer, the answer that requires Genesis and Psalms and Acts and the entire sweep of the biblical narrative to tell, is more expansive and more dignified and more spiritually demanding than the version that was handed to a people in chains. You are in this book. You have always been in this book. And knowing that changes how you read the warning. It does not make the warning less urgent. It makes it more personal, more specific, more addressed to you directly by name. Because the warning in Genesis is not a general advisory for humanity. It is a covenant communication. And covenants are not addressed to the general public. They are addressed to the people of the covenant, the people whose story runs through the text, the people whose lineage, whose suffering, whose emergence, and whose destiny are written into the book that has been sitting in your hands your entire life. When you know where you are in the story, the warning starts to sound different. It stops sounding like a curse, and it starts sounding like a call to something specific, a call to the kind of discernment that the present moment is demanding with an urgency that cannot be overstated. A call to see clearly what is actually happening, to understand what it means in the context of the covenant, and to respond not out of fear or despair or the kind of exhaustion that the pressure is specifically designed to produce, but out of the identity that Genesis has been trying to hand you since the very beginning of the book. The question is not whether you are in the story. You are in the story. You have always been in the story. The question is whether you know it clearly enough to act like it. There is a scene in Genesis 41 that does not get enough attention. Joseph has just interpreted Pharaoh's dream, the 7 fat cows and the 7 lean cows, the 7 full heads of grain and the 7 thin heads scorched by the east wind. 7 years of extraordinary abundance across the land of Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine so severe that the abundance will be completely forgotten. That is the interpretation. That is what God showed Pharaoh and what Joseph, standing in a linen robe with his hair freshly cut after years in prison, delivers with clarity and without hesitation. But then Joseph does not stop talking. Pharaoh did not ask for advice. He asked for an interpretation. Joseph gave him the interpretation. And then, unbidden, he keeps going. He tells Pharaoh, "Let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." Joseph interprets the crisis, then he immediately offers a strategy for surviving it. He does not wait to be asked. He does not position himself carefully before speaking. He does not shrink from the full weight of what the moment requires. He stands in the presence of the most powerful man in the world, and he says, "Here is what is coming, and here is what wisdom looks like in response to it." Discernment and strategy, held together in the same breath. That is the posture Genesis is calling Black America to right now. Not one without the other. Not spiritual insight that produces no practical action, and not strategic activity that is untethered from the covenantal framework that gives it meaning. Both together, in the same breath that Joseph used when he stood before Pharaoh and refused to let the magnitude of the moment shrink what God had placed in him. So what does discernment actually look like in this specific moment? What does it mean to see clearly what is happening and respond the way Genesis asks the covenant people to respond? It starts with refusing the two temptations that the pressure is specifically designed to activate. The first temptation is despair, the accumulation of losses, the legal rollbacks, the institutional pressures, the wealth gap that stubbornly refuses to close, the health disparities, the ongoing grief of watching systems that took generations to build get dismantled in a single political season. This accumulation is designed to produce a particular kind of spiritual fatigue that looks like realism but functions like surrender. It says, "We have tried everything. Nothing works. The system is too entrenched, the opposition too organized, the gap too wide to close. Why keep fighting?" The Joseph narrative answers that question not with optimism, not with a cheerful insistence that things are not as bad as they seem, but with something harder and more durable than optimism. It answers with the evidence of what happened to a man who sat at the bottom of a pit, who served in a prison on a false charge, who was forgotten for 2 years by the one person who could have helped him, and who never once in that entire arc let the circumstances define the limit of what God could do. Joseph did not have optimism in the pit. He had covenant memory. He remembered who he was. He remembered what had been placed on him. He remembered the dreams. And here is the remarkable thing about the Joseph narrative. The text never tells us that Joseph doubted the dreams. Not once. Not in the pit, not in the prison, not in the 2 years of silence. The man who was sold for 20 pieces of silver never appears in the text to have concluded that the dreams were wrong. He held them in the dark, in the silence, in the circumstances that made those dreams look absurd. That is covenant memory, and it is the specific antidote to the despair that the present moment is trying to produce. The second temptation is assimilation. If despair says give up, assimilation says disappear, blend in, make yourself less visible, less threatening, less distinctly yourself in a cultural and political environment that is applying pressure against the expression of Black identity, Black excellence, Black institutional presence, and Black historical memory. Sand down the edges, soften the claim, make peace with the terms the empire is offering rather than holding out for the terms the covenant declares. This temptation is more sophisticated than despair because it arrives wearing the clothes of pragmatism. It says, be strategic, pick your battles. Do not draw unnecessary attention. Navigate the current environment with enough flexibility that you survive it. And there is a grain of wisdom in that framing that makes it dangerous, because tactical flexibility is real and necessary, and something Joseph himself demonstrated. Joseph learned Egyptian. Joseph served Potiphar with full competence. Joseph operated within the structures of the Egyptian system without pretending those structures did not exist. Tactical wisdom is not the same as identity surrender. The line between the two is this: Joseph never stopped being Joseph. He navigated Egyptian culture and Egyptian power without becoming Egyptian in the way that would have required him to abandon what God had placed in him. When Potiphar's wife offered him the transactional convenience of betraying his integrity for the relief of her approval, he refused. Not because he was inflexible or unsophisticated or unable to read the room. He refused because there are lines that tactical wisdom cannot cross without destroying the thing that makes the person worth saving. Black America knows this line. The Black church has preached this line for generations. There is a version of survival that costs you the very thing you were supposed to survive in order to preserve. And the Genesis warning is, in part, a warning against paying that price. So discernment in this moment means holding both. Tactical wisdom about how to navigate a hostile environment without surrendering the covenantal identity that makes the navigation worth anything. But discernment is only the beginning. Genesis 41 does not stop at Joseph reading the moment clearly. It moves immediately into the strategy, and the strategy has specific, identifiable components that translate with remarkable directness into what Black America needs to be building right now. The first component is storage. Joseph tells Pharaoh to collect a fifth of the harvest during the years of abundance and store it. The logic is simple and profound simultaneously. You do not build reserves during the famine. You build them during the years when building is possible. You create the infrastructure of survival before the crisis that will require it, not in response to it. For Black America in this moment, the storage principle is a call to institution building with an urgency that the present political environment makes absolutely non-negotiable. The HBCUs that are under funding pressure need Black financial support from the community they serve at levels that have historically not materialized at the scale the institutions require. The Black church, still the most powerful institutional infrastructure in the Black community, still the most trusted, most organized, most geographically distributed institution that Black Americans have ever built, needs to be functioning as an economic and social institution, not just a spiritual one, in the way it functioned during the civil rights movement when it housed the strategy, funded the operations, trained the leaders, and sustained the community through the years of direct confrontation with the empire. The Black-owned business ecosystem, the Black financial institutions, the credit unions, and community development financial institutions that were built specifically to provide capital to a community that was systematically excluded from mainstream financial systems. These are storage. These are the reserves. And the Joseph principle says you build them now, with the resources available now, with the energy and the urgency that the 7 lean years ahead require you to have applied during the 7 fat years. The second component is distribution. Joseph does not just collect the grain, he distributes it strategically from cities positioned to reach the regions that need it. The infrastructure of storage is only meaningful if it is connected to a distribution system that can move resources to where they are needed when the crisis makes movement difficult. For Black America, distribution means the networks, the mentorship pipelines, the information sharing between communities that are experiencing similar pressures in different geographies. The way the Black church at its best has always functioned as a distribution network, moving not just food and money, but knowledge, encouragement, strategy, and the reminder that you are not navigating this alone. The isolation that the present moment is trying to impose on Black communities, the way political and cultural pressure tends to make people feel like their experience is individual and exceptional rather than collective and covenantal, this isolation is one of the most effective tools in the empire's kit, and the antidote to it is the distribution network. The recognition that what is happening to you is not happening to only you, and that the covenant people have always survived by remaining connected to each other, even when every external force was working to sever those connections. The third component is leadership that sees ahead. Pharaoh looks at Joseph and asks, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" The quality that distinguishes Joseph in that moment is not charisma. It is not political skill. It is not the ability to tell people what they want to hear. It is the combination of prophetic sight, the ability to read the moment accurately, and practical wisdom about what the reading requires in response. Black America needs leaders right now who can do both. who can look at the current political and cultural landscape and tell the truth about what it is and what it is doing and what it is designed to accomplish, and who can then move without paralysis into the practical work of building the response. Leaders who are not so captured by the urgency of the current crisis that they lose sight of the 7 years after this one. Leaders who are not so focused on the long game that they fail to address the immediate suffering of people who cannot wait for a decade-long strategy to materialize. The Black church has historically produced exactly this kind of leadership. The tradition that gave us Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and John Lewis, the tradition that shaped the intellectual and moral architecture of every significant advance toward justice that this country has experienced. This tradition did not emerge from despair, and it did not emerge from assimilation. It emerged from the practice of reading the moment through the covenant, from the discipline of sitting with the full text of Scripture, including the parts that were kept from the people in the fields, and asking what God is saying to this specific people in this specific moment. That is the practice Genesis is calling us back to, not as an academic exercise, not as a nostalgic return to a tradition because the present is too frightening to face directly, but as a living, operative, strategically urgent practice of discernment that has always been the covenant people's most essential survival tool. Because here is what Genesis 41 ultimately shows us about Joseph. After Pharaoh appoints him as second in command over all of Egypt, after Joseph is given a new name and a wife and the full authority of the empire placed in his hands, after all of that, during the 7 years of abundance before the famine, the text says Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. He was not sitting in the palace administering from a distance. He was present. He was moving through the land. He was doing the actual work of the strategy he proposed. The covenant people do not wait for the moment of elevation to start working. They work in the pit. They work in the prison. They work in the years of abundance before the famine because they know the famine is coming. They work because the dream has not expired and the covenant has not been revoked, and the God who spoke on the night of the stars is still the God who sees what the morning is going to bring before the people can see it themselves. That is the discernment the moment demands, not fear, not despair, not the kind of spiritual noise that confuses activity with preparation and emotion with action, but the steady, covenant-grounded, Joseph-shaped practice of seeing clearly, building deliberately, remaining fully yourself, and working with the knowledge that the afterward the covenant declared is not a comfortable metaphor. It is a destination, and the people who arrive at it are the people who refuse to let the pit be their permanent address. The question Genesis leaves us with is, not will things get worse? The question is, do you know what time it is? Go back to Genesis 15 one more time. Not to the warning, not to the 400 years, not to the suffering and the mistreatment and the nation that will be held accountable. Go back to the verse and read all of it. Read the part that comes after the warning. Read the part that the warning was always pointed toward. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. Afterward. With great possessions. That is not a footnote. That is not a secondary thought that God added to soften the blow of the suffering he was about to describe. That is the destination. That is the place the entire covenant arc was always moving toward from the moment God spoke it into the night air over Abraham's head. The suffering was real. The warning was real. The 400 years were real. And the afterward, the emergence, the coming out, the great possessions is just as real as everything that preceded it. And I want to close by talking about what that promise actually means, not as a comfortable spiritual consolation that lets us avoid the full weight of the present moment, not as a theological painkiller that numbs the senses just enough to make the current conditions tolerable without addressing them, but as a living, operative, covenantally grounded promise that has demonstrated its staying power across centuries of pressure that should have extinguished it many times over and did not. Because here is the thing about the promise in Genesis 15 that the black church has always known in its bones, even when it could not always articulate it in chapter and verse. The promise is not just about what comes after suffering ends. The promise is about who you are in the middle of it. The promise is the declaration that the people God is speaking to, the people whose descendants will be strangers in a strange land, who will be enslaved and mistreated, who will carry the weight of 400 years, these people are not defined by what is being done to them. They are defined by what God has spoken over them. And what God has spoken over them is not captivity, it is emergence, not bondage, possessions, not the pit, the afterward. The promise precedes the suffering in the covenant order. That is the extraordinary thing about Genesis 15 that gets lost when we read it as a linear chronology of events. God does not first watch the suffering happen and then decide what to do about it. God speaks the promise before the suffering begins. The afterward is declared before the 400 years start, which means the suffering never had the power to cancel what was already spoken. The pit does not have the authority to revoke a covenant that was established before the pit was dug. The Black Church has been preaching this truth, sometimes without knowing the exact chapter and verse, sometimes through the deep interior wisdom of a tradition that survived more than it had any earthly right to survive for as long as there has been a Black Church in America. Listen to what this community has produced in 400 years of navigating conditions that the promise in Genesis 15 describes with haunting accuracy. They produced the spirituals, songs composed by enslaved people who had no legal right to their own bodies, no guaranteed right to remain with their families, no material basis for hope of any kind. And those songs reached toward a God they could not see, with a musical sophistication and a theological depth that trained European composers could not match and could not explain. Nobody gave those songs to enslaved people. They came from inside. They came from the covenant memory that the chains could not reach. They came from people who, in the pit, were still dreaming. They produced a tradition of intellectual achievement under conditions designed to make intellectual achievement impossible. In the decades immediately following the Civil War, in the thin oxygen of Reconstruction, when literacy had been illegal for generations and the infrastructure of education for Black Americans was essentially non-existent, Black Americans built schools. They founded colleges. The historically Black colleges and universities that are still standing today, still producing graduates, still sending engineers and doctors and lawyers and teachers into the world, were built by people who had just come out of bondage, people who were starting from less than zero by any material measure, people who did not wait for the larger society to provide what the covenant had already declared they were entitled to. That is Genesis 15. That is the afterward beginning to appear. They produced the civil rights movement, not spontaneously, not accidentally, not as a desperate reaction to intolerable conditions, though the conditions were intolerable. They produced it through decades of disciplined organizing, strategic legal work, theological preparation, community formation, and the kind of sustained moral clarity that can only come from a people who understand that their cause is not just political but covenantal. The legal architecture of the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, did not come from nowhere. It came from a people who believed that the law of the land needed to align with the promise that had been spoken over them long before the land existed. It came from Howard Thurman's theology and Thurgood Marshall's legal genius and Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony and John Lewis's body absorbing the violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge with a dignity that the violence could not touch. because the covenant is not carried in the body. The covenant is carried in something the batons cannot reach. That is Genesis 15. That is the afterword continuing to unfold. They produced a cultural influence that defies every material explanation. Black American music has shaped the sound of the entire world. Black American art, Black American literature, Black American film and fashion and language and intellectual tradition have penetrated every culture on earth in ways that the people doing the penetrating did not engineer and cannot fully explain. A community that was legally defined as property generated a cultural output that the people who defined them as property could not produce and could not stop consuming. That is not sociology. That is not demographics. That is the covenant producing what covenants produce when the people inside them refuse to let the pit have the last word. Great possessions. Not only material, the great possessions of Genesis 15 are not only gold and silver and the literal wealth that the Israelites took from Egypt when they left. They are the possessions that matter across generations, the wisdom, the creativity, the spiritual depth, the moral clarity, the capacity to suffer without being destroyed by the suffering, the ability to build in the wilderness, the dream that survives the pit. These are great possessions. These are what come out with the covenanted people when the afterward arrives. And Black America is carrying every one of them right now. In the middle of the famine, in the middle of the institutional rollbacks and the wealth gap and the political pressure and the particular weariness of this specific historical moment. Carrying great possessions, moving toward an afterward that the present conditions are doing everything in their power to convince you is not real. I want to speak directly now to the person who came to this video carrying something heavy. Maybe you are tired in a way that sleep does not fix, the kind of tired that accumulates across years of watching the same injustices replicate themselves in new forms, while the people who were supposed to be allies find reasons why this particular moment is not the right moment to stand up. The kind of tired that comes from loving a community deeply and watching the pressure on that community intensify in ways that feel designed to produce exactly the despair and the disconnection that would make resistance impossible. I see that weight. This is not a moment that requires you to pretend it is lighter than it is. But I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically. I want you to actually sit with this question. Joseph was at the bottom of a pit, abandoned by the people who should have loved him, headed toward a foreign land he had not chosen and did not want. And somewhere in that journey, in the terror and the grief and the complete collapse of the life he had known, the text says God was with him, not that it felt like it. Not that the external evidence supported it, not that a reasonable analysis of his circumstances would have produced confidence that the dreams were still operative and the covenant was still intact. The text simply says God was with him, and then it shows us across 2 decades of a narrative that refuses to rush its own timeline what that presence ultimately produced. The promise in Genesis 15 is not a promise that the suffering will be brief. It was never that. The promise is that the suffering is not the final word, that the nation that perpetrates it will face a reckoning, that the people inside the covenant will come out, that afterward is a real place on the map of God's intentions, not a poetic consolation for people who have run out of other options. The Black church has always known this. It has always preached this, not with the naivety that pretends the famine is not real, but with the covenant memory that knows the famine has a duration and the afterward has a dawn that the famine cannot cancel. That tradition is not decorative. It is not a cultural artifact to be appreciated from a respectful distance. It is a living survival technology, the most sophisticated, most tested, most proven technology for navigating exactly the kind of moment Black America is navigating right now that has ever been developed. And it is contained in the same book that was used to justify the chains, which means the reclamation of that book, the full reclamation, the reading of Genesis that includes chapter 10 and chapter 15 and chapter 50, the reading that finds your ancestors in the table of nations and your covenant in the promise to Abraham and your strategy in the life of Joseph. That reclamation is not just an intellectual exercise. It is an act of resistance. It is the refusal to let the enemy's use of your inheritance be the final word about what that inheritance contains. Genesis 50, verse 20. Joseph, standing before his brothers who sold him, his father is dead. His brothers are terrified that without their father's presence to restrain him, Joseph will finally unleash the retribution they have known all along they deserved. And Joseph, the man who sat at the bottom of the pit while they ate their meal above him, the man who served in the prison on a false charge, the man who waited 2 years for the cupbearer to remember him. Joseph looks at his brothers and says, "This, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." That is not the statement of a man who minimizes what was done to him. He is not saying it did not happen, or it was not as bad as it seemed, or the people who hurt him had understandable reasons that make their choices forgivable on pragmatic grounds. He is saying clearly, you intended harm. That is true. That is the record. That is what happened. And then he says, but. That but is the most important word in the entire Joseph narrative, maybe one of the most important words in all of Genesis, because that but is the covenant operating in plain sight. That but is the declaration that the intentions of the people who threw him in the pit did not have final authority over his life. That but is the proof that 20 pieces of silver and a false accusation and a prison and 2 years of being forgotten were not sufficient to revoke what God had spoken over him before any of it happened. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. That is the word for Black America right now. Not a denial of the harm, not a minimizing of the centuries of intended damage, the systems built to extract and diminish and contain and suppress. Not a spiritual bypass that asks a wounded people to skip past the wound and go directly to the gratitude. The harm was intended. That is true. That is the historical record. That is what the evidence of 400 years documents with brutal clarity. But God intended it for good. And the good that God intended is not only personal. Joseph says to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. The covenant people's emergence from the pit is not just for themselves. It never was. The Joseph who came out of prison and stood before Pharaoh and interpreted the dream and proposed the strategy and administered the reserves during the famine, that Joseph saved Egypt. He saved Canaan. He saved his brothers who sold him. He saved a world that had no idea the famine was coming and no plan for surviving it without him. The covenant people carry something the world needs. Not in a way that diminishes their own humanity or obligates them to endless service to people who have not demonstrated the willingness to honor what they carry, but in the deep theological sense that the gifts placed on the covenanted people, the creativity, the spiritual depth, the moral clarity forged in the fire of 400 years, the dream that survived the pit, these gifts are not only for the community's internal benefit, they are for the saving of many lives. They are for the afterward that benefits everyone on the other side of the famine. The warning hidden in Genesis is real. This is not the moment to look away from it. The pressure on Black America right now is real. The rollbacks are real. The famine is real. The weariness is real. The grief of watching protection stripped away is real. Do not let anyone tell you that clear eyes about the present moment are a failure of faith. They are not. Joseph's eyes were clear about every chapter of his story. He did not pretend the pit was a palace. He did not tell himself the prison was comfortable. He did not act as if the 2 years of being forgotten were not 2 years. He saw clearly, and seeing clearly was part of how he was ready when Pharaoh called. See clearly, and then remember Genesis 15. Remember Genesis 50:20. Remember the table of nations in Genesis 10, and the psalm that declares Ethiopia stretching out her hands to God, and the entire sweep of a biblical narrative that has never, not once, presented the African peoples as peripheral to the story of God's movement in the world. Remember that you are in this book. Remember that the covenant does not expire. Remember that the afterward is a real destination on the map of God's intentions, and that no famine, no matter how severe or how long, has the authority to cancel what was spoken on the night Abraham looked up at the stars and God said, "Count them, count the stars, that is how many." The warning in Genesis is not the last thing God says. It is the honest middle of a promise that begins with stars and ends with emergence and great possessions and the saving of many lives. The promise outlasts the warning. It always has, and it is addressed to you.